Right, here we are where we left off in part 1, and now we're going to animate this frame and have a lot of fun in the process. In order to do that, I need to set up a few things to actually animate this thing when we click it. The first thing, of course, is we need a state. So I'm going to add a boolean to represent that. Is on, I'm going to call it, because why not? And then I'm going to turn off debug so we can see what we're doing and resume at this point. Now I need to animate this, and I'm going to animate it on click. But I don't want to worry about whether I'm clicking on something solid, especially if we're in debug mode like this. So I'm going to put a content shape around this toggle of type capsule. Content shape, capsule. And then on tap gesture, all I'm going to do is toggle is on. I'm not going to put that inside an animation block because I'm going to deal with the animation implicitly. I want the various components of this toggle to animate independently. And the reason for this is that we have a little bit of a problem when it comes to animating this frame. Ordinarily, you might just stick an ease in out animation on something and Bob's your uncle, everything's fine, it looks great. Unfortunately, in this case, we've got an animation that starts in this position and ends in this position. And in the process of animating, it has to go through 2 ease in out cycles, when it goes from the squeezed position and when it goes back to the squeezed position. We can't achieve that with a simple animation. So what we're going to do is supply our animation with a linear one and take care of the easing inside the shape itself. That's where the fun part is, but let's set up the animation first so we can get to it. I'm going to put this implicit animation here. Animation, linear, with a duration of 1 for now. And then we go down to our shape. And I'm going to turn this shape into something animatable. Now, shape does conform to animatable. However, we need to give it the animatable data that it is going to manipulate for us in order to generate the animation. So I'm going to say that our animatable data is a CG float, and in the initializer, I'm going to set it based on whether or not the toggle is on. Animatable data. If the toggle is on, then it's 1. If it's off, then it's 0. Now this might be quite confusing to those who are not familiar with the animatable framework. I've done a couple of episodes where I've focused on animations, so they might be useful to you. However, I will try to sum it up very briefly now. If you are something that conforms to animatable, and you are modified within an animation block, be that inside or with animation, or as part of an implicit animation, as we're doing here, then SwiftUI can take the animatable data, the changes you make to it between states, and it will supply you an interpolation of values between those 2 states based on the duration and the curve that you're associating with the animation. But all you need to take away from this is that we are going to be supplied values from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0, and we can use that to create that ease in out behavior that I was talking about earlier. Now, if you've seen my videos on layout guides, you will know that when it comes to building shapes, layout guides are solutions looking for problems. In this particular problem, we're going to use them in a way I haven't shown you before. But before we do that, I need to pass in the isOn parameter into this shape. So let's do that now. IsOn. And now we're ready to go, so we can go down to our shape. And what I'm going to do is take that curve offset and make that the maximum curve offset. So take this up here, duplicate it, and this is the maximum offset. And now we can resume. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a layout guide that exists inside a rectangle that is square with the sides being max curve Y offset in length. It's going to have an origin of 0, so we can use the transformation of the layout guide to drive the animation of our frame. Let me set this layout guide up and then I'll explain in a little more detail. So the offset layout guide is a layout guide of type polar, and I'm going to lay it out in our custom rectangle. There's nothing that says I have to lay it out in the rectangle we're supplied on line 50. I'm going to create my own one with the specifications I mentioned earlier. A rectangle with a size that is square and the sides are max curve Y offset. I'm going to give it 1 ring and 1 segment because we don't care about the actual coordinates in this layout guide. That's not what we're using it for. and I'm going to rotate it by 360 degrees with a factor of animatable data. So that means when factor is 0, as in if the toggle is switched off, it's not going to be rotated at all. If factor is 1, it's going to be rotated by 360 degrees. And then as the factor goes from 1 to 0, it goes the other way. This is going to allow us to turn a translation into a rotation. So we're being supplied this linear interpolation of the animation, and we're going to turn that into a sinusoidal one. It's going to be easier to picture this if I put the point on the layout guide that we're interested in on the screen. So I'm going to go down here and comment this lot out. And I'm going to put a circle in with a center that is the offset layout guide center and a diameter that is the max curve Y offset. And then I'm going to put on another circle with a center of the bottom of the layout guide and a radius of 4. And there's our point that we're interested in. Now, if I play this, when I click, the rotation is linear. But look at the point and how the Y coordinate varies. Because it's on a circle, it is easing in and out of the various positions. So it eases from the bottom, it eases into the top, out of the top, and back to the bottom, regardless of the direction that it's going. So it's symmetrical, and that's what we want. So I can take this and replace the curve Y offset with the Y coordinate of that point. Now watch this. Look at that. We've got exactly what we need, and we haven't had to use any trigonometry for this. All we're doing is using the Y value of a point that's going around a circle based on a linear rotation. So all we have to do now is get rid of these. We can go down here, uncomment this lot, and then we go up to our shape, set debug to false, and now we've got our beautifully animating frame. We've got time to put in the button before the end of this episode, so let's do that. It's not going to be a shape this time because we don't need custom shapes, so it's actually going to be a layered view. So let's go down to the bottom here and put in our view. We'll call it toggle button. It doesn't take any properties, but we're going to put the whole thing inside a geometry reader and a Z stack inside that, just like we did up the top. So geometry reader, Z stack. And for now, we'll just put a circle in. We'll go back to the top, resume, and then refer to it here. Toggle button, just like that. Now, as you can see, that button is too big because we want it to fit inside our frame with a little bit of a gap. So I'm going to make it 90% of the height. That's very easy. I just put it in a frame like this. Frame, size, height, scaled, 0.9. So now we've got the right size for our shape. We can now go down and start making it. And we're going to use two gradients for this. One is going to be a linear gradient for the bevel around the edge, and one is going to be a radial gradient to give the inside a bit of a concave look. And the first one we're going to do is going to be the linear gradient for the bevel. So that looks like this. Let outer gradient equal a linear gradient with the following shades of white, 0.45 and 0.95. And we're going to send that one to the top leading. And then we can make this circle take that gradient as a fill. Fill outer gradient. Now that's our outer gradient taken care of. That's the bevel. That's going to make the lighting look like it's coming from the top left, which is what we want. And now I'm going to put the inner circle on this one, and we're going to inset that circle by 10% of the width, which is the same as 10% of the height since we are in a square. Circle, inset, geo, width, scaled, 0.1. And that looks about right. And now we're going to create our radial gradient for this one to give it that concave look. Radial gradients are slightly different from linear gradients in the sense that they need to know absolute values. We can't put ratios in this. It needs to know precisely the radius it's going from and to, which is why we need to put it inside the geometry reader so we can use ratios to calculate the absolute size it needs to be, because we want this thing to be size agnostic. So we need to base it on the size of the frame. Let inner gradient equal a radial gradient with the shades of white 0.9 and 0.3. The center is going to be the bottom trailing. It's going from the radius of the width scaled by 0.2, and it's going to the radius of the width scaled 1.5. It's going outside the actual circle, but it won't actually go outside because it will be clipped by the shape. So now we can apply the inner gradient to our inner circle. Fill inner gradient, just like that. So now we've got our button that's looking fantastic. There are a couple of things we need to discuss before we move on. The first thing is we could have done this by using a stroke border for the bevel. I'll show you what that looks like and why you shouldn't do it that way. So we can say stroke border with the outer gradient and a line width the same as the inset, geo width scaled 0.1. And then we comment out the fill. At first glance, you think that might be okay, but we have some leakage due to the anti-aliasing around these two shapes. If I put red on this, background color red, and then I zoom in, then you can sort of see the red poking through. And you will get this whenever you try to match up shapes precisely. In my experience, it is always better to overlay shapes rather than try to line up the edges so there aren't any gaps. Because we could play around with insets here, we can make them slightly overlap, but it would be very messy indeed, and it's much easier to just overlay shapes on top of each other so you don't have to fight with this problem. So let's go back to where we were, uncomment that, get rid of that, get rid of our background, because the next problem I want to show you is about shadows. If I put a shadow on this, which we're going to want to do a bit later on, then you can see that the shadow is not only put on the outer circle, but also on the inner circle, which is not what we want. There are a couple of ways of solving this. You could put a shadow on the first circle, which would solve the problem. But I don't want this shadow to be intermingled in our view like that. I want to control the shadow externally. So the way I like to solve this particular problem is to just put the whole thing in a drawing group. It rasterizes to one thing, and then the shadow can apply in its entirety. Drawing group. And there you can see the shadow is going to be applied to the whole thing. Let's get rid of the shadow, and then we can animate this thing to round out the episode. All we need to do is animate from the left to the right based on whether or not it's switched on. Because we know the dimensions of this toggle, we are in complete control of that. So we just need to offset it. If it's on, half the height, and if it's off, minus half the height. On the toggle button, we say X offset is on, and we want to offset size half the height. Otherwise, we want to do minus size half the height, like that. So that's now going to be in the right position. And now we just want to animate it. If I click on this, it will jump straight over, even though the middle is animating correctly. We want to match up with that. And remember, we generated an ease in out profile for that animation, which we can match with an implicit ease in out on the toggle button. Animation, ease in out, the duration of 1. We'll extract that out into a constant later. But now, if I click this, it matches up beautifully. That is exactly what we want. We're now in a great position to move on, and in the next episode, we're going to create and animate the morphing icon that represents the state of this toggle. So join me for that. It's going to be brilliant. If you're liking it so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more. And more importantly, hit the like button and then subscribe for more. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please leave them below. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. See you next time.